Hello and welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Devin DeCuna, joined alongside by Daniel Davis. On the show today is Kimberly Palmer, author of Generation Earn, Spending, Investing, and Giving Back. Generation Earn has crafted a clear-eyed, well-researched, engagingly written book that goes far beyond finances and careers and gives roadmaps for how to best conduct our lives. Kimberly, thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Real pleasure.
You know, well, one of the things that I find interesting is that you say young adults are financially irresponsible. What do you think is the source of this misconception?
Well, I actually think that there's a huge myth out there that young adults, and by that I mean people in their 20s and 30s and even 40s, don't understand money at all. There's sort of this name we've gotten called generation debt, and it basically suggests that we overspend, we buy things like new iPads and iPods, takeout. Yeah, and we're not responsible. But I think that's actually a huge myth and kind of does a disservice to our generation to talk about us like that, because if you actually look at the numbers and the trends in terms of how we compare to our parents' generation, we're actually not that bad. And in a lot of ways, we make some good decisions with our money, partly because we, of course, just lived through a recession, and that all happened right as we were coming of age.
And you know, Kim, I was wondering, what are some of the biggest mistakes young people make when it comes to using their credit cards?
Well, one of the biggest mistakes actually is going too far in the direction of avoiding debt altogether. Credit cards have gotten a pretty bad name for good reason. I mean, they're such an expensive way to buy things, especially if you don't pay off your debt each month. But there are actually a lot of good and useful things about credit cards, and as long as you're paying your credit card off every month, credit cards can be a really valuable tool. And so some young people go so far in terms of avoiding credit cards that they have no credit history. And so when it comes time, when they're ready to buy a house or buy a car, they don't have any credit history there, and then they're not able to do that. So that's why I usually recommend, of course, paying off your debt every month, not carrying any credit card debt. But as long as you're using the cards responsibly, then it can be a good idea to have an account or two that's in your name.
Kimberly, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you on your first child.
Thank you so much.
Now, I noticed that you talk about in your book, kind of when a good time for when a young couple gets together to consider having a baby, because this here is definitely an awesome responsibility, especially this day and age where it seems under-earning is prevalent. Talk about how a young couple coming together should kind of approach this particular challenge, if you will.
Well, the biggest, most important thing to do is to realize how basically expensive babies are. I mean, it's so easy to just get wrapped up in the awesome, amazing side of becoming parents, and of course it is amazing, but babies are really expensive, and the latest numbers actually from the Agriculture Department, which tracks these things, suggest that we spend on average $12,000 a year on our babies, and that's just a lot of money, and not all of us have that amount lying around. And so when you become parents, it can add a lot of stress onto you financially. So the first step is just to make sure you understand how expensive having children is and how you're going to pay for certain things like childcare if you need it, and all of the necessities like cribs and other gear, because it really adds up.
And one of the interesting things I found was that you say credit cards have deserved a bad rap they don't deserve. What are some of the things you like about credit cards?
Well, my favorite thing about credit cards is the rewards that you can get. And I should say, first of all, that this should only be used, credit cards should only be taken advantage of in this way if you do pay off your debt each month. If you're not doing that and you're racking up debt, then you just need to focus on paying it off. But if you are being responsible, then credit card rewards is this whole world that you can really take advantage of. I know personally, I use credit cards to get free dinners, free cash back, and I mean, it can add up if you're using credit cards responsibly in order to pay for things that are little indulgences or splurges, as a lot of reward programs offer. So that's one of my favorite things about credit cards.
And just to go along with that question, when you look at our generation, what are some of the positives and negatives you see when it comes to young people handling money?
Well, I think that it's hard to ignore the fact that we just really experienced such a difficult time and, of course, are still experiencing it. And I think that the recession has left a really lasting impression on people in their 20s and 30s. It's made us realize we have to become more financially literate. We can't just trust other people with our money. A lot of us want to learn about investing now and even see it as fun and enjoyable. So I think that's really the big takeaway that is interesting about our generation, just how important we realize financial literacy and personal finance in general is. That's the part I really like. And you can see really a blossoming of blogs and websites aimed at our generation that focus on being smart about your money.
Kimberly, you couldn't be further right on the money when it comes to the idea of actually saving. And I think a lot of times, especially this day and age, people are starting to feel tainted, almost jaded, if you will, when it comes to saving and trusting in the investments that they have. I mean, for instance, the whole banking system basically imploded in 2008. I know that you work as a columnist for U.S. News and World Report, so you were probably at the epicenter of a lot of that reporting there. And what was fascinating about that whole thing was the fact that the banking system itself decided to do what it originally wasn't allowed to do, which is to put consumer money at risk. They weren't supposed to be doing that, but due to a lot of deregulation starting from the Reagan administration all the way till today, caused a lot of these problems. So you have to start becoming more financially literate, as you suggest, especially this day and age, so that you can safely know where to put your money. So at the end, you're not dealing with some kind of ridiculousness like an Enron debacle or a WorldCom scandal and realizing I had all my money in these areas and now I'm 65 years old and I've got to start all over again if it's even possible.
Yes, that's so true. And what I think is interesting, too, is that a lot of young people and older people lost so much trust in these financial institutions that we're almost afraid to put our money in the stock market now, which might be a good thing considering how things have been going. But really, in the long term, it's probably not a good thing to have that trust so eroded. So really, financial institutions have a long way to go in terms of earning back that trust.
You know, Kim, one of the things I was wondering is what part do the parents play in their children's personal finances?
Such a big role. Parents play the biggest role, bigger than teachers, bigger than friends. They're really setting up the foundation for how their kids think about finances. And study over study has shown this over and over again, that parents are really set the tone for how we think about money, whether we're going to be more savers or more spenders. And so the number one most important thing that parents can do is really model good behavior for their kids. And that's a lot easier than it sounds because, of course, not everyone has an easy time showing how to be a saver. But even little things like talking about the decisions that parents are making themselves when you're at the grocery store, or even paying your bills each month, how to stay on top of your money and set aside savings each month. I mean, establishing those habits early on really sets the tone for the rest of your life. And as I interviewed 20 and 30-somethings for this book, that is what it kept coming back to. If I asked someone who was a good saver how they got that way, it almost always came back to the lessons and the example that their parents set.
And you know, this is kind of funny to me. Whenever I think back of the things I've wasted money on, like video games and movies and clothes and all of this stuff that I barely use, I was wondering if, Kim, you had an experience where you looked back and said, oh my God, what am I thinking? Why did I purchase this?
Yes, well, I am still traumatized by my first car purchase, which was a couple years ago. Because, I mean, as you know, that's a huge purchase. And I also bought a house in the last couple years. And for me, the car purchase was many times more stressful than the house purchase, even though, of course, the home is much more expensive. But buying a car today is just so overwhelming and complicated, and you have to negotiate and know a lot of background and arm yourself with information before you go in. And I left the car dealership just feeling like we completely overpaid. We hadn't done our research. Of course, they kept us there for hours, so by the end of it, we just wanted to pay and leave. So next time I buy a car, I'm definitely going to be much more prepared.
Oh yeah, I remember. I'm just gonna tell a quick story. I remember a couple of years ago, I joined a gym. I wanted to just like bulk up, but it never worked out. I spent like maybe 2 months there, and I wasted like maybe $200 a month, and I didn't like improve anything. I lost a little weight, but I didn't like bulk up like I had planned, and I just felt like a just like a failure because I didn't do what I set out to do, and I just wasted like $600 for the 3 months I was there. So you definitely have to be smarter.
I know that gym membership fees. That's another huge one, and the problem, of course, is that it's monthly. So you just keep on paying until you basically admit to yourself that it's not a worthwhile expenditure. So that's definitely a big one.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't worthwhile, and I wish I had my money back. And just another thing that stood out to me while reading the book is your section on giving back. And I was just curious on what are some of the charities you like to donate to.
I actually find myself really drawn to charities that work with street children who live in India. And that's for a couple of reasons, but partly because I read some books on that topic, and my in-laws come from that area, and my sister volunteered at a charity that works with street children there. So that's my passion project that I just, love contributing to and learning more about. And I hope to, one day be even more involved. Right now I'm just involved on a, relatively small donation level, but eventually it'd be great, as I write about, to combine the money donation with the time and volunteer work aspect.
Interesting.
And, I think another important financial decisions for a person to make is buying your first home. And in your opinion, Kim, when do you think is the right time for someone to make that kind of decision?
Well, the problem is that people usually feel like they should buy a home too soon, and that's partly because we have this myth that's really left over from the real estate boom that renting is just throwing money away, which really could not be further from the truth, because if you're young and in transition, you might be moving or getting married or any other type of transition that would mean you need a bigger or different house. It's really not a good idea to buy because those transaction costs of buying are just so big. It's not easy to quickly move or quickly sell your home. So I usually encourage people to wait longer than they would otherwise, and really wait until they can not just afford it, but comfortably afford it, because so many expenses can come up as you get older, from having a baby, for example, and other unexpected costs, and your budget might be a lot tighter than you thought. So I usually am more pro-waiting. For me, it just happened that we suddenly needed more space. We had a baby, and so, of course, those kinds of life events also happen where you just suddenly need to move and you feel like you're ready to settle down.
Kimberly, I was going to ask, as this generation is coming up and beginning to steward, if you will, the world, back in the day, and I mean this goes back a long way, especially since the Industrial Revolution of people earning and whatnot, but how important is it for this generation to keep up with the Joneses? Because this becomes a real trap a lot of times for couples.
It does. I think and I hope that we're beginning to let go of that. And as I interviewed people, it did actually seem like the whole lusting after the bigger house, the bigger television, it sort of became a little passé with the recession. The whole idea of frugality, that became almost cool or popular, and it became enviable if you got the best deal, or you shopped at a really affordable thrift store, or you really put time into finding low-cost options. So we did definitely see that switch a little bit during the recession, and now who knows what will happen as we move forward, but what I hope is that will have a lasting impression, because really it, of course, just got so out of hand over the last decade or so, and in a lot of ways contributed to a lot of our financial problems.
Yeah, I just wondered about that. I recently was watching a movie called Company Men starring Ben Affleck, and here he was a young executive, making $125,000 a year with incentives. He's got the upper middle class house. He's got his Porsche. Then all of a sudden one day he's downsized out of his job and he's only in his mid-30s, you know. And you have to think to yourself, okay, what do you do then? But here was the question. He had all of those things, even though he had the look of wealth or of doing well, but basically it was on borrowed time, if you will, on credit, if you will. But the whole reason he was that way is that's what was necessary to look successful. How important is that for this generation?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think that it still does carry some weight, and people still want to invest in themselves if they think there will be a payoff. So if you need for your job to look a certain way, to sort of present yourself in a certain way, then I mean, it can be expensive to get going. And actually, that one of the people I profiled in my book had exactly that problem, where she graduated from college, was ready to start her first job, but didn't have her really professional-looking suit. And sort of almost needed to buy into that lifestyle before she could afford it. And that, of course, is how a lot of people get into debt. So I think there's definitely still, tension and potential for overspending and getting into trouble because of that.
You know, in the times we're living today, I think everyone is looking to save a buck. And in the book, you mentioned that all kinds of retailers offer discounts, and if shoppers are willing to negotiate in terms of strategy, is there anything you recommend people do as a first step when they're bargaining?
Yes, and the first step is really just to get over the awkwardness. I'm a huge proponent of negotiating on prices. I mean, even, like you said, even when you're in big stores, department stores, prices are not hard and fast. So there's just so much potential to make a simple statement like, is there any room for negotiation on that, or is that the final price? And that can open up a whole conversation that eventually brings down the price for you. And the easiest way is to just go, when you go shopping, do online research ahead of time so you know roughly what you can expect to pay, maybe what competitors are offering even lower prices. And that works best on tech items, actually, if you're buying something like a TV or a computer, because stores, I mean, they don't want to lose your business. So there's a decent chance that they will, at the very least, match their competitor's price.
And if people end up in debt, what would be the best way to go about tackling the debt with and eventually paying it off?
The first thing to do is to get organized. I mean, once people get into debt, they often have the situation of paperwork piling up. They might even have people calling them about it. And basically, you can easily feel really overwhelmed. And so, number one, you have to just get organized, attack that paperwork, make piles and lists of what exactly you owe. And then, I mean, first step is just to develop a plan for paying it off. So, of course, you usually want to start with the highest interest rate debt, which is almost always on a credit card, and then move down to your lower interest rate credit cards. If you have any other kinds of debt like student loans, personal loans. And, I mean, eventually you can pay it off. If you really feel overwhelmed, you might even want to work with a credit counselor to help get you organized. But number one is getting organized.
And then I also wanted to ask about this concept in your book about voluntary simplicity or minimalism. Can you explain what it is and how someone who's interested in it might go about that?
Yes, well, this actually gets back to the earlier point about keeping up with the Joneses. This whole idea, and really it's a trend now of minimalism and celebrating simplicity, is all about not keeping up with the Joneses and deciding, I would prefer to live in a smaller home, and I'd prefer not to have all this stuff in my house, to live with less, to go for the cheaper options. And it's really become a lifestyle, and there's a bunch of blogs that really celebrate it. So really it's just about scaling back and thinking about what you really need and what you don't need and what's important to you. So, for example, you might decide that you'd rather go camping for the weekend instead of going on a fancy resort vacation, and all sorts of lifestyle decisions like that save you so much money.
Now, speaking of lifestyle decisions, when we make the assumption here that young people are getting together, it's pretty important because I've actually heard these stories. A couple gets together, they're not even married. The next thing you know, the guy spends all the money and she's working doubles for the next 3 years to pay off $75,000 in debt. And I'm thinking, how did this guy get away with something like that? or it could be just the other way around. She spent them into the poorhouse. As they get together, you talk about keeping your finances or at least your credit separate, because that can be devastating through the actions of someone else. Tell us why that's important.
Yes. Well, one thing that we see over and over again is that people are drawn to opposites. I mean, opposites attract, of course. So it's so often that you end up dating or married to someone that is either a spender when you're a saver or vice versa. And so, I mean, the first thing really is just to understand where you're each coming from. And there's always clues early on, whether it's how you choose which restaurant you go to or how you pay for different things like meals, what kind of gifts you give to each other. So just coming into the relationship knowing where there might be potential for conflict, and most importantly, how to talk about it and setting aside time to talk about it if you do have different conflicts there. And in terms of your question about keeping things separate, it's interesting. I mean, personally, I prefer to combine all my money with my husband. That's just what works for us. But I did hear from a lot of couples that say it works best for them when they keep their money separate. And it often happens if you're coming into it with different amounts of assets. Maybe one person has worked for longer and maybe saved more and wants to make sure to protect that. Of course, if you're already thinking about that, it might suggest other kinds of conflicts in your relationship. So really, bottom line is to talk.
And, Kim, one of the things I was thinking about is, where do you stand about using credit cards versus using the debit cards for your spending?
I actually prefer credit cards, and that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, credit cards, as compared to debit cards, come with all kinds of protections. Things like if your account gets hacked into and money is stolen, credit cards usually have more protections in place. You can contest with companies that charge you and you think they're in the wrong for having charged you for certain things. You can contest that through your credit card company. So basically there's more services, protection available to you through credit cards. Secondly, I just think it's easier to stay organized. So if you're uploading your information into a spreadsheet or a free online tool like mint.com, I just find it easier to track using credit cards, because debit cards usually have direct bill pay and other kinds of complications on it. So if you want to just track your spending each month, then credit cards can make it a little bit easier.
And then what kind of advantages do young people like me have compared to other generations in regards to their finances?
I think the biggest advantage, I mean, it sounds like a disadvantage, but I do think it's an advantage, is that we lived through such a tough time. A lot of us graduated into a period where it was really difficult to find employment. And that lesson, even though it was a really hard lesson, it taught us a lot of the lessons that our grandparents or great-grandparents learned way back in the Great Depression. So I think if we take from it the useful lessons and we sort of continue to embrace frugality and avoid the keeping up with the Joneses mindset, then, I mean, in the long run, I think that we'll come out ahead.
So I've got a question for you, Kimberly. What is the perfect $5 family dinner?
I wrote this blog post recently after realizing that I just felt like I had found with my husband the perfect cheap family dinner. So for us, it's tortilla soup. I use a Barefoot Contessa recipe, and basically we calculated only costs $5 each time for each meal. And that's a pretty good price, I think, especially, of course, compared to something like takeout. But it's easy to make. Everyone in my family, even my toddler, loves it. So that's why I'm a fan of tortilla soup.
Well, not to mention, I can also suggest that you can write about the $13 spaghetti dinner, that if for about $13 to $14, you can actually make really good homemade spaghetti. And we're talking about several quarts worth.
Wow, okay, I'll have to get that recipe.
With Italian sausage, mushrooms, and onions, of course.
Nice.
Exciting stuff. Now, what made you move in this direction to produce this book, Generation Earn?
I just felt like there was such a lack of information for young people about the positive side of money. There's so much negative, as we started off talking about. just the whole concept that we're drowning in debt and bad with money. And I wanted to write about the more empowering, positive side of money because I think young people want that and are thirsty for that. I mean, we want to feel good about our financial lives and be on top of things. And so that's why I wrote Generation Earn, to try to help people do that.
I think the perception, too, is that a lot of people think this is a generation that can't really think for themselves because they've been babied and cuddled, but I don't agree with that. There may be quite a few of them out there that fit that particular characteristic, but there are a lot of young people that really, they're on the ball. I mean, they're pretty aware of what the heck's going on out there, and, obviously you are working with U.S. News and World Report. What would you say about that statistic?
I think that you're right that it is a myth. When you really look at some of the newer surveys that have come out after the recession, so you see the impact that the recession has had on all of our attitudes, I think that you do start to see that we actually, a big chunk of us, like you said, are on top of our money, and we are optimistic about our future, and we are motivated to be smart about money. We don't want to be that old stereotype about being drowning in debt. So I think that we have moved past that.
Mm. And Kim, I was wondering, has anyone given you advice on when it comes to financial stuff, or was it just all from your experience?
Well, it really goes back to my parents. I mean, I found a letter my mom wrote me and my sisters when I was a teenager, all about how she and my dad were frugal and advice for us on how we should be frugal and always save a quarter of our income, and a lot of the themes that are now, I'm writing about every day. So I think it really goes back to my parents, and then as I just write about this more and interview people, it all just adds to it. But I just can't get enough of this topic. I love writing and talking about money.
How about this, Kimberly? When do we start telling our parents to lay off the advice?
You think parents give too much advice?
Well, no, it isn't so much that. It's just once in a while you find yourself, and I don't know about your experience, but I remember as I was a young adult starting out, and I would say, I'm thinking about moving in this direction here and doing this. Then you'd hear your mother just espouse all this other worldly sage advice, and you're like, all right. So then later on down the road, it could be a few years, well, I'm thinking about doing this, and then here comes the advice again, and you're looking at your mother going, now, wait a minute, I don't remember, really asking for your advice. I'm just telling you something I'm thinking about doing. Then there came a time where I was actually thinking about buying a home, and then my mother's just all, well, are you sure you can do this? You sure you can do that? And I said, did I ask you all those questions when you decided to just pick up and move to another state? So you get to a point where you finally have to say to your parents, either, A, I'm not going to be talking too much to you about what it is that I want to do. I'd like you to just back off and let me enjoy my own experiences and maybe make my own mistakes.
Yes, that is a good point. I guess there's a balance there, and maybe it depends on what age you are, too. I think my parents give me less advice now.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things I learned is making my own mistakes, and I've definitely made my share of them. So, looking back, after reading this book, if I knew then what I knew now, I definitely would have had a lot more money.
Now let's talk about the $2,000 kiss.
Yes, well, this is an interesting concept. Basically, it goes back to what we were just talking about with couples and how couples often have conflicts about money. So the idea here, and this wasn't my idea, but a psychologist I quote in the book, who basically discovered that when you have a fight, when couples have fights, that it often leads to spending sprees just because people need to make themselves feel better. So when you're upset about your relationship, you go maybe buy yourself a new outfit or some kind of indulgence. You go to the spa, whatever it is that makes you feel better. And her idea is that if instead of after a fight going shopping, you basically just kiss and make up and hug, other things that get your endorphins flowing, you won't have to go shopping. So her argument, which I think is an interesting one, is that we should just kiss each other when we want to go on a shopping spree.
Ah, that sounds pretty good. Plus, it feels a lot better, too, doesn't it?
Yes.
Kimberly, if you can, for our listeners, talk about your website and what your blog is all about.
Yes, well, my website, generationearn.com, basically gives all the background on my book and where I'm coming from. And if my blog, which is linked to from generationearn.com, Alpha Consumer, which I write on U.S. News website for U.S. News and World Report, I'm writing every day or at least a few times a week about things like the $5 family dinner or other ways of saving money just in your daily life. And that's where I respond to people who have specific financial questions, which I always like getting, and write about what's going on in the news with money and how it impacts your personal finances.
The book is Generation Earn. Our guest here on the Beyond 50 radio program, Kimberly Palmer. Kim, thank you so much for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
You bet. I'm Daniel Davis, along with Devin DeCuda. Devin?
Yeah, like I said before, if I knew then what I knew now, I probably would have saved a boatload of money instead of blowing it on clothes I don't wear, video games I barely even play, movies I don't watch, whatever. So, this was a really good book for me, and now I will try and take Kim's strategy and just use it for any future purchases that I want to make, and just really think about it before I actually go out and buy it.
And most importantly, you don't beat up on your mistakes. Don't beat yourself up doing that. It's all experience. Again, Generation Earn is the book. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. Be sure to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. That's the number 50, and sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. I'm Daniel Davis, along with Devin DeCuda. Thank you for joining us, and remember, live your day past halfway.